For those of you who don't know me, my name is Mary Marcy, and I am the president of Dominican University of California, and we are very excited to be hosting this event with a number of groups in Marin County. So rather than spend a lot of time giving you our background, I will tell you a couple of essential things about the evening, including the kind of pace at which we will go through things this evening. Before I get started, though, for those of you who got here a bit earlier, I'd like you to join me in thanking Jessamine Fry, who was our cellist earlier this evening. I only heard a few notes kind of wafting over to the green room, but she's with Musicians for the Planet, and we're very thankful. So I was thinking about this evening's gathering in a couple of ways. One of the things that I realized is that it's extraordinary for its grassroots effort. And we talk about that perhaps too frequently in society and think it just means a few friends getting together with good intent. This is a lot more than that. And what I was thinking about was that there are a few times in our nation's history, indeed in the world's history, when people get together and decide that things need to change or they need to be improved. And we know about those times. If any of you have seen the new movie, you know that women were not given the vote, they secured the vote for themselves based on a community movement. You know what happened when India secured its independence. It was a grassroots movement of people led by inspiring community leaders who said life needs to improve. And that movement inspired the civil rights movement in the United States, which was also a grassroots movement founded on people's hard work, good spirit, intensity, and willingness to put the community ahead of individual need. So this evening, I believe we're doing something very similar right here in Marin. This is a grassroots movement that we believe can make a difference literally in our world. The organizers, Organizing for Action and Sustainable San Rafael, include 41 partners and supporting groups, and they've worked for 8 months to make this event happen. This event happened as we prepare for Paris and as we think about how to make a difference in our world. The 12 primary partners include 350 Marin, the Marin Conservation League, the Golden Gate Electrical Vehicle Association, Cool the Earth, Citizens Climate Lobby, Environmental Forum of Marin, Resilient Neighborhoods, Sustainable Marin, the Marin School of Environmental Leadership, and Shore Up Marin. Thank you. We also know that change happens not only through citizen action, but through policy change. And we have a number of public officials that are joining us this evening and showing their support for this effort tonight. So quickly, and if I miss anyone, you need to wave at me because we want to make sure and acknowledge you. Damon Connolly, District 1 Supervisor. Katie Rice. Katie Rice, District 2 Supervisor. Katie Sears, District 3 Supervisor. San Rafael City Council members Kate Conlon and Andrew McCullough. Novato City Councilman Pat Eklund and Pam Drew. Sorry, councilmen and women. Mill Valley City Councilwoman Stephanie Moulton-Peters. From the Larkspur City Council, Kevin Hariff. From the San Anselmo Town Council, Ford Green. From the San Rafael School Board, Linda Jackson. From the North Marin Water District, Rick Freites. From the Marin City Community Services District, Nancy Johnson. From the Ross Valley Sanitary District, Frank Eger. From the Las Galinas Valley Sanitary District, Megan Clark and Judy Schreibman. And from the Fairfax City Council, Renee Goddard. Now, our congressman is also here this evening, and I'll introduce him in a minute. Did I miss anyone else who's in the elected official here this evening? I do believe that change happens through people power, and it also happens through elected leadership, and we have a great combination here this evening. We also know that tomorrow Marin's Board of Supervisors will be considering a resolution on climate, and 22 of our organizing groups have already signed their own similar Marin proclamation. Ken Alex of the Governor's Office and Congressman Jared Huffman will be taking our message and our support to Paris. But it's not only by showing up that we make a difference, it's by agreeing to take action. Here at Dominican, we believe we can take action, and we have. I'll tell you a couple of things, and I hope you notice it when you walk around campus. Meadowlands Hall is recently renovated. It was reopened just this fall. It's a historic building, and it was renovated to Silver LEED standard. And it has, for any of you going into the depths of the building, you will see lots of recycled material. You'll see a great attention to the history of this region and this community. You'll see solar panels on the roofs, and you'll see a lot of happy students and faculty and staff. We think we can do this in the right way. And we're committed to making all of our renovations and all of our updates to the campus in a similar fashion. We also have a lot of campus conversations going on, including a climate change colloquium that has been led by our faculty this fall, and we welcome you to that discussion. So now I'd like to welcome our speakers who are joining us this evening, and I'll let you know the kind of program for the evening. I mentioned that I think we can all take action. If you look in your programs, we're going to ask you to take action. This is more than listening to a conversation. So please look in your programs and sign up to make a difference, and we'll give you an opportunity at the end of this conversation to talk a little bit more with some of the leaders of these community groups. The plan for tonight's panel is as follows. We'll ask each of our distinguished speakers to give presentations, and they'll give a relatively brief presentations, 10 to 15 minutes each, and then we will join together in a panel, and that's the time in which they will discuss, comment on each other's presentations, and take questions from the audience. So throughout, you will have a chance to get question cards, and you can write a question on those cards and hand them in, and we'll do our best to cover as many questions as we can. So I now have the pleasure of jumping right in and introducing this evening's speakers. Our speakers are Bill McKibben, the founder of 350.org. I realized I could take a lot of time by giving long introductions to each of these folks, and I'm literally going to let them speak for themselves. There are brief bios in your programs, but I'm going to just tell you who they are and what they represent. Ken Alex is part of the UN climate delegation, and he's the director of Governor Jerry Brown's Office of Planning and Research. Josh Friday is the chief operating officer of Next Gen Climate Action. Our congressman has been a leader in this area, is a Democratic assistant whip, Congressman Jared Huffman. And Susan Stevenson is the executive director of Interfaith Power and Light. And without further ado, we'll get started. We're going to hear from Bill McKibben on video, and we're all wondering if he's going to talk about Keystone on this video or not. So let's stay tuned.
Hello there, this is Bill McKibben, and I wish I was there with you in part because I remember how beautiful that campus is and of course San Rafael, but just those trees and just the mood. I'm glad that you're there, and I'm glad you're doing what you're doing. And what you're doing couldn't be more important. You guys have figured that out because you've gotten to watch front row seats what it is that's going on in our planet. California has a better sense than anybody else, I'm sad to say. The ongoing drought and the fires that come with it, and the sinking land in the Central Valley, and the crazy rates of asthma now, especially out in places like Fresno, where the smoke from the wildfires is combining with the dust. And I mean, one of the most beautiful spots in the whole world. Where I mean, I was born in Northern California and always think of it as, in many ways, my roots, one of the most beautiful spots on the whole face of the earth. Last winter had no snow up there in the Sierras, up where John Muir helped us understand what wilderness was about and the preciousness of this planet. And of course, if California illustrates the problem, California also, in no small part thanks to you guys, illustrates a lot of the solutions. What a year it's been already. The work that you guys did on the wonderfully named SB 350, on Bill 32, maybe most of all on SB 185, making sure that CalPERS and CalSTRS begin, not end, but begin the process of divesting. Those were some of the biggest victories around the world in this climate fight. That can't come soon enough. 2015 will be the hottest year globally. And the kind of effects that you're seeing in California, we now see everywhere around the world, and many of those places not rich like California, so unable to deal with them in even the ways that you can. Tens of millions of people facing starvation right now in the Horn of Africa as this El Nino-fueled drought spreads to that part of the world. As I say, the best of times and the worst of times, and the kind of surge of activity around the world is really inspiring. We head off for Paris in a little while. Paris isn't the game. Paris is the scoreboard. We're finding out how much pressure we've put on over the last few years, and the answer is a lot more than in Copenhagen, where they came away with nothing. This time, no world leader can go home with nothing. They're going to have to force the fossil fuel industry to swallow a little bit of change. But the answer also is that we won't come home with enough. The scoreboard will show us still heading for a world 3 or 4 degrees warmer. And so we badly need to keep fighting. We keep talking about not the road to Paris, but the road through Paris. You guys are doing amazing work. 350 Bay Area, 350 Marin, all your colleagues and compatriots and frontline communities. I mean, that's one of my favorite parts of the world to work in and to be in and to get to visit in, because you've got, such diversity from the beautiful mountains and coasts of Marin to the very gritty but beautifully organized cities like Richmond, to the great progressive and intellectual powerhouses that are San Francisco and Berkeley and Oakland. It's no wonder that change is starting to come. No wonder that you're beginning to produce leaders like Kevin De Leon, or get old lions like Jerry Brown up and doing the right thing. We need more of it. We need to stop fracking in California. We need to get yet more divestment. Every bit of that helps, as you can tell. We're up now to portfolios and endowments worth $2.6 trillion divested from fossil fuel. We need to keep holding accountable the fossil fuel companies that got us in this mess. And I'm sure that you all have read in recent weeks these new exposés of what Exxon knew and when. They're enough to boil my blood. But I hope you also have some moments, even amidst all the destruction and all the hard work, to get out and bear witness to the beauty of the world that's still around us. You live in one of its most beautiful corners, and it will never be more intact than it is now. So one of our jobs is simply to recognize that, and to be out there in that world a little bit, paying heed to its great beauty and integrity and power. The beauty of that world and the beauty of the people in it. That biodiversity mirrored by the great diversity in human communities. This is an astonishing planet. And you there on the Pacific edge, you have a great sense of that astonishment. Our job is somehow to keep it alive for the people who will come after us. Thank you so much for all you're doing in that regard.
I know Bill McKibben wanted to be with us this evening. He was actually on this stage last year, and we're really pleased that he was willing to send us that video. And I don't know how many of you were thinking this when I was listening to him, but it was wonderful to take my morning hike, which I usually do for exercise in the mornings, and be able to hike in the rain this morning. It felt very good. I'd now like to invite Ken Alex, who's a UN climate delegate and the director of Governor Jerry Brown's Office of Planning and Research, to come and share his thoughts.
Good evening. Can you hear me? Okay, I'll bend down. Okay, that's better? Okay. Well, thank you for being here. Apparently there's nothing to do on Monday night in San Rafael. No, it's really extraordinary to see 800 people taking their Monday night, being here at Dominican University and sharing it as a community to talk about and to hear about really, as the governor has taken to call it, the greatest existential threat to our planet. So, California is standing by itself the world's 8th largest economy. That means that of the 195 countries that are gathering in Paris starting on November 30th, California's economy is larger than 186 of them, but California does not have a seat at that table. So what do? Well, we have chosen sort of, I guess I would call it a two-pronged strategy. First, domestically, we are taking action across the board and have the most comprehensive climate program and greenhouse gas emission set of efforts of anywhere in the world. And second, I will talk a little bit about, even though we're not a country, sometimes we like to think we are, and I'll talk a little bit about our foreign policy. Unfortunately, the main issue with our foreign policy is Congressman Huffman's, some of his colleagues, of which I do not certainly include him, are somewhat difficult to deal with. But let me talk about what we're doing in California, and then talk a little bit about our international effort. So the governor, in his inauguration, his 4th inauguration address, talked about climate and 5 pillars of action. We have a goal under the governor's executive order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions 40% from 1990 levels by the year 2030. That's 15 years from now. Right now, we are above 1990 levels. We have a law that requires us to reduce to 1990 levels of greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2020, 5 years from now. We're on target to do that. That's about 430 million metric tons of carbon released into the atmosphere by California as a whole every year. And by 2030, we need to be at about 260 million tons to reach that 40% reduction. That is an extraordinary effort that it will take to get to that level of reduction. It is a very difficult chore that faces all of us. If you think about your own personal life, you're likely very similar to California as a whole, which means that About 35% of your emissions come from your use of energy, and about 40% comes from your use of transportation. And if you think about reducing 40% of emissions from those two sources, it is a very challenging endeavor. So, 5 things that we're doing sort of broadly. First of all, 50% of our power by 2030 will come from renewable sources. Right now, we're as a state getting very close to 30%. We're required to be at 33% by 2020. We will get there well before. And amazingly enough, and this just underlines the fact that California has an economy growing faster than the rest of the United States while we make this change. 10 years ago, the utilities in California said that they could not reach 20% renewables. And last year, California's 3 utilities supported a 50% renewable portfolio standard by 2030. So we are making change and showing that an economy the size of California can make that change. Second, we are going to double our energy efficiency in buildings by 2030. That is a large undertaking, and to be honest, we have not done as well as we had hoped on energy efficiency in buildings, so we'll see a lot more effort around that goal. Third, and this has been controversial, we are attempting to reduce the use of oil in transportation by 50% by 2030. Now, if you understand how you get the reduction of 40% of greenhouse gas emissions, you have to reduce that amount of oil. You have to leave fossil fuels in the ground. There's no other way to do it. So it's only controversial to the extent that oil companies have made it so, because it's inevitable. But if you think about it, as the governor likes to say, you know, Chevron is having a bad year. They're only making $2 billion a month. So this is a rather difficult fight when you're talking about, for oil companies as well, an existential set of issues. So those are the first 3 pillars. 2 others have gotten less attention because the governor didn't number them, but they were in his speech as well. The 4th is something called short-lived climate pollutants. Most greenhouse gases, including CO2, the largest emission, last 100 or more years in the environment. So if we produce them today, they will be there when we die. But short-lived climate pollutants are different, and they, if we remove them from production, they will be out of the atmosphere within our lifetimes. The largest of these is methane. Methane comes significantly from agricultural endeavors, about 60%. Some of it comes from landfills, and some of it comes from oil and gas operations. We can make very big strides with methane, and we have a reduction goal of about 40%. We also HFCs, which are refrigerants. The growth of air conditioning around the world, India and China in particular, if we don't do anything about HFCs, 27% of the world's emissions will come from air conditioning and HFCs by the year 2050. So there are alternatives, and we're working on that internationally as well as nationally. Black carbon, which is also particulate matter, where California has been the world leader, reducing our black carbon by 90%, and we're going to reduce it another 50%. So, and then the final 5th pillar of our domestic effort has been around working and natural lands. Right now in California, particularly with the fires that we've had this year, working lands and natural lands are sources of emission rather than sinks. And Marin County is the home of something called the Marin Carbon Project, which is learning how to use compost added to soil to sequester soil, and has the potential to be quite an amazing change. So all of these things work together in California. We have a plan across all of it to make very large strides to reduce our emissions over the next few years, and it's coming very rapidly. But California is 1% or 1.5% of the world's emissions. So what we've started to do is to work with countries. China is one of our biggest partners in trying to deal with some of China's pollution challenges, where California has made great strides, reducing by 50%, or excuse me, 90%, as I mentioned. We're trying to work with China and help them with that effort. We're working with them on the cap and trade program that they've decided to implement countrywide in the next couple of years. We have reached MOUs with Mexico. We're working with India. So we're reaching out around the world to try to help places where we can help with some of the strides that we've made here in California. But one of the biggest elements and efforts that we're making is something that we've dubbed the Under 2 MOU. Under 2 for two reasons. First, under 2 degrees warming. We want to hold the world, and 350.org is kind of has the same concept with the idea of holding temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius. And second, under 2 tons per capita emissions by 2050. Right now, California is about 10 tons per capita. So an 80% reduction by 2050 gets us to about 2 tons per capita. And that is the goal of the Under 2 MOU, an 80+% reduction for developed regions around the world, and a under 2 tons per capita for developing areas. So when California figured out that we don't have a seat at the table, we looked around the world and realized that there are other subnational entities, provinces, states, cities, that are in the exact same situation. They do not have the authority to sit at the international negotiations, but they are the source of most of the reductions in the world. And there are places like California that have much higher ambition than the international community. And so we decided, along with a partner in Germany called Baden-Württemberg, to create this MOU and ask subnationals to join us. So to date, we have gathered 53 jurisdictions from around the world, representing $14.8 trillion of GDP, making this entity the second largest GDP behind the United States in the world if you combine us together, representing 600 million people, developed and developing areas, rainforest states, African states, the biggest industrial states in Europe, and a number of states in North America and Canada and the United States. And thank you. So by the time we get to Paris next month, we will add a number more, and we will have the largest GDP of any entity represented in Paris. And we will... It's sometimes nice to be California. And we will get to say to the world that we need more ambition. We need more ambitious targets. We need a way to increase our targets if they are insufficient. And we need to be able to share technology. We need financial arrangements that work for developed and developing countries. And we need to pay attention when California and other areas of the world say, we are doing the actual reduction work and we can do this. So it is part of California's effort to present that, and as Bill McKibben said in the video, This is the road through Paris. And we're developing a secretariat. We have an entity that's going to be our secretariat to bring these jurisdictions together, not just in Paris, but moving forward, we're thinking about how do we work together and take action as a unit, doing things like creating greater markets for zero-emission vehicles, not just in California, but everywhere in the world. So when I hear that Marin is going to provide California with support in this effort, it's exactly what we had hoped. And we hope, yes. We hope for that support from communities, from cities, from counties, from regions all over the state, and building this from the grassroots up, and letting the nations of the world know, the 195 nations of the world know that we're here, that we're working on it, that we can make this successful, and that we're not going away. So thank you for being here, and thank you for your support.
When I mentioned grassroots movements and I mentioned policy, I should have mentioned the intelligence and the creativity to lead, including developing your own foreign policy if you need to. So now I'd like to ask Josh Friday, the Chief Operating Officer of Next Gen Climate Action, to come and share his thoughts.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me here. President Marcy, as you said, it is inspiring to see this turnout, to see our community step up in this manner, and to see this grassroots movement and momentum here today, as well as to have the opportunity to hear from California's leaders and leaders of our community. It's really special. I want to start off by thanking Sustainable San Rafael and Organizing for Action, who just did an incredible job of pulling us all together. So we owe them a big round of applause. They promised me when they invited me to do this that when it came to giving a talk about climate, this would be among the friendliest crowds in America. So I'm going to hold you all to that. I also want to thank, of course, Dominican for hosting us, and it's really an honor to be on stage and to be a part of this with such incredible people. There isn't a week that goes by at work at Next Gen Climate, which was founded by Tom Steyer, a businessman and philanthropist dedicated to this generational challenge, that Bill McKibben's name doesn't come up. And so to be here is really incredible. And how lucky, first of all, how lucky are we to be represented by Jared Huffman? I think we should all. And if Tom Steyer was here, he would thank you, Jared, for being such an important and effective champion for climate and such a wonderful representative of our area. So thank you so much. Lastly, I was told that there's some Dominican students. Are there any Dominican students here? If you're a Dominican student, can you stand up? We owe you, all you Dominican. Let's acknowledge our students here because you are the future. So after this, go home, study hard, stay engaged because we're counting on you.
So I was asked tonight to talk about whether climate can be a top issue in next year's election. And there's no doubt that we have momentum. With this year's Clean Power Plan, the Pope's encyclical on climate, last week's rejection of Keystone, which was awesome. Now we're getting fired up. And upcoming activity in Paris, things are absolutely moving in the right direction. And we really believe that. The question for us, though, is are things moving fast enough? And what do we need to do to accelerate the politics of this issue to create the political space so people like Congressman Huffman can do what he would actually like to do, which is to prevent climate disaster and promote prosperity for all Americans? And to answer this question, we believe that we need to do three things. First, ensure that climate change is part of the conversation and that candidates and politicians talk about real solutions. Second, aggressively frame the economic and health benefits of climate action. And third, drastically broaden the coalition of those calling for a clean energy economy. So first, the conversation. To change the politics of this issue, we need to change the political conversation around climate. And that means first by changing how Americans think about it. And by Americans, I don't just mean those of us in the room attending a climate talk on a Monday night. It also means changing how politicians talk about it. We need a political conversation in this country that is focused on climate solutions and clean energy and not pointless debate about established scientific fact. Fortunately, though, in the last couple of years, we have seen the conversation shift. In 2013, when Tom founded NextGen Climate, we had just come off a presidential election, you may remember, in 2012, where climate was rarely discussed or debated by either side. And the president, although a Democrat, you might remember, was also promoting an all-of-the-above energy strategy, including clean coal. At the same time, Republican politicians were competing over who could be more hostile to climate science. Then, in 2014, after the environmental community spent almost $100 million in the midterm elections, a drop in the bucket compared to the oil industry and Koch brothers, but nonetheless an unprecedented amount for our side, Republicans started to backtrack ever so slightly with, of course, their priceless 4 words, "I'm not a scientist." And now in 2015, the conversation has evolved further. The president has taken bold steps to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and has done what many of us have waited years for by taking what was once a done deal in Washington, the Keystone Pipeline, and instead said no to dirty energy and yes to a clean energy future. And voters want this future. Let's be clear. These numbers will cheer you up in case you needed it. According to a recent New York Times Stanford poll, 81% of all Americans believe that climate change is real and is caused by human activity. And 2/3 said that they were more likely to vote for political candidates who actually campaign on fighting climate change. Another recent poll, even more encouraging, showed that 72% of Republicans and 68% of conservative Republicans support accelerating the development and use of clean energy. At NextGen Climate, we have launched an aggressive national campaign asking leaders at all levels to embrace what California has, the goal of achieving more than 50% clean energy by 2030, putting us as a country on a path to 100% clean energy by 2050. Reaching this goal is not just achievable, and it's not just necessary to prevent climate disaster, both of which are true. It is also politically popular. According to polling in key battleground states, in places that don't necessarily vote for people like Jerry Brown, 84% of Democrats favor getting to 50% clean energy by 2030. 69% of independents favor getting to 50% by 2030. And get this, a majority of Republicans in these swing battleground states support our country getting to 50% clean energy by 2030. And this is what we are seeing. This is what we are seeing. The country is moving. Voters want solutions, and candidates are being forced to take note. For example, earlier this year, Senator Marco Rubio, a Republican candidate for president, said that sea level rise is a problem in Florida during a New Hampshire town hall. Shocking, right? We take what we can get. He even went as far as to say that America should lead the world on renewables like solar and wind. Now, he did then go on to say, as many Republicans do, that even if climate change is a problem, we can't destroy our economy by addressing it. Which I'll share a little secret among us friends, that's actually not true. But you can see how the debate and the conversation has changed since 2012. Now, this change of heart, or at least this change of talking points, doesn't necessarily mean politicians have seen the light, but it does mean that they're paying attention to the polls. So what does this tell us about how we make sure climate is a central issue in 2016? We must use this polling and momentum and turn it into actual votes and actual action by voters in key battleground states, where the candidates are paying closest attention during the election and where they all, just like Senator Rubio in New Hampshire, visit dozens of times between now and Election Day. So to be successful, we must make climate a kitchen table issue in these states, the states that matter the most. And we do it by making climate change first and foremost, and this is important, first and foremost, not just an environmental issue. Because as we know at its core, climate change is a human issue. Tackling climate change is about creating good-paying jobs for working families. It's about ensuring our kids can live healthy lives. And it's about creating a more just society where we all prosper and where we protect the most vulnerable among us. Climate change is our greatest challenge, yes, but it is also one of our greatest opportunities. It's one of our greatest opportunities to create jobs, to strengthen our economy, and to lead the world, and we need to tell that story. I think we're going to take a quick moment to show just a couple quick ads that Next Gen Climate has created. Hope you enjoy them, and these are showing in Iowa, and New Hampshire, and Ohio, and Florida, and other key places around the country, and now you get a chance to see them here in San Rafael, California.
Dear world, we are presently witnessing a disturbing warming of the climatic system. As often occurs in periods of deep crisis, we are tempted to think that what is happening is not entirely clear. Politics and business have been slow to react in a way commensurate with the urgency of the challenges facing the world. Many things need to change course, but it is we, humans, above all, who need to change. We need to see that what is at stake is our own dignity. Leaving an inhabitable planet to future generations is first and foremost up to us. Let ours be a time remembered for the awakening, the firm resolve to achieve sustainability, and the joyful celebration of life.
If you think storm damage is the only cost of climate change, think again. From the rising price of food to higher insurance rates for homes and businesses, the economic damage will only get worse. But with American-made clean energy, we can save money on electricity and spur innovation to create new businesses and jobs. It all starts with 50% clean energy by 2030. So, what are we waiting for?
Making the economic case for clean energy has never been more important. And the truth is, quite frankly, it's never been more exciting. Here in California, we have already proven that we can protect our environment while still growing our economy. And today, Next Gen Climate released a first-of-its-kind report, so you get all the breaking news here, conducted by ICF International, demonstrating that implementing a real path to decarbonization will, 1, boost our economy, 2, create millions of American jobs, 3, raise household disposable income, and 4, actually lower energy bills. The detailed report, which you can read on our website, shows that by increasing energy efficiency and investing in clean energy, the economy will add more than 1 million net jobs by 2030, and up to 2 million jobs by 2050, including as many as 1.2 million jobs in the construction sector alone as a result of building wind farms and solar power systems and modernizing existing buildings and infrastructure. It also shows that by reducing emissions 80% below 1990 levels by 2050, the United States would also increase our GDP and save American families over $40 billion in their electric bills in 2050. Now, in politics, we call those good talking points. But we also don't need to project into the future to make our economic case. Currently, there are twice as many Americans as employed in our solar industry than in coal mining. Think about that dramatic change for our economy and our country in such a short period of time. Tom Steyer often likes to point out that solar is creating jobs 20 times faster than the broader economy. And 1 out of every 78 jobs created in America is a solar job. And that's happening today. In addition to the extreme economic benefits of clean energy, we can and should point out the economic risks of inaction.
Tom Steyer, Hank Paulson, and Mike Bloomberg put out a report last year called Risky Business that calculated the extreme economic risks of not taking action on climate. And just yesterday, the World Bank, not necessarily a left-wing enviro machine, put out a report that said climate change could push more than 100 million people into extreme poverty by 2030. Think about it, 100 million more people. So to ensure that this is really a central issue in our political discourse, we are on the ground and on the airwaves in key battleground states, making this case to voters every single day. Next Gen Climate is running aggressive TV, digital, and field campaigns in key early states like Iowa, where we have over 60 staff on the ground and 10 offices around the state, and New Hampshire, where we have over 5 offices and 25 staff on the ground, and other important states like Florida and Ohio and Pennsylvania and Virginia. And we're also meeting young voters where they are on universities and on campuses. The last thing we need to do that we talked about, in addition to setting the right economic framework, is to make sure that we must work to broaden our coalition beyond just the environmental community and increase the number of diverse voices asking for climate change. In every state and community we are working in to advocate for clean energy and a sustainable economy, we spend enormous time building relationships and working with non-traditional allies like business, the faith community, communities of color, and labor, to name a few, and we are having enormous success again. For us to win, this cannot just be an environmental issue. I'll finish by saying this. You don't have to live in Iowa or New Hampshire or Ohio to help us make this a top issue. And I'd ask everyone in this room, in addition to signing the action cards that you were all given, to visit nextgenclimate.org and sign on to our 50 by 30 campaign. We need your help. We are confident that climate can and will be a top issue next year. Because at the end of the day, climate change is not just our greatest challenge, it's also our greatest opportunity. And everyone here knows that. This is a challenge America was built to solve, and it's the kind of opportunity we will always have taken advantage of. And there's no doubt that together we will do it again. Thank you.
So remember, the folks are coming down the aisles with cards. If you have questions, we'll have a chance to ask the panelists a little bit later. I will say that in putting this on the political agenda for next year, the presidential agenda, one of the things a few of you may have heard about is that we're going to be hosting a virtual debate as part of the presidential debates next year. We're going to be doing it here at Dominican, and the goal of that is actually to help drive the agenda. We're going to ask college students all over the country what their top issues are, and I think they need to talk to Next Gen, so thank you, Josh. Now I'd like to introduce our own congressman who's been a leader in this area from the time he stepped into office, give him a chance to share his remarks. Congressman Jared Huffman, Democratic Assistant Whip.
Well, thank you, President Marcy, and how great to see all of you. Before we get started, I have a note that says that there's a plug-in Prius in the parking lot with his lights on. So, just wanted to see half the room reach for its keys. You know, where else could a member of Congress who's environmentally minded and works on these issues come and meet with over 800 of his constituents to talk about climate change and not see anyone with pitchforks? I've got it pretty good, and there's no better place to be discussing the challenges and opportunities of climate change than here in the Bay Area, where we are so used to pushing the envelope on forward-looking energy policy, and of course here in California, where we're setting the national agenda in so many ways, as you just heard from Ken Alex. Just look at all of you. Look at all the climate leaders in this room. Look at Marin Clean Energy and Sonoma Clean Power. Look at the kind of leadership we have at the state level with AB 32, now SB 350, and more. decades of careful policy making that has improved our energy efficiency and dramatically expanded our use of renewables, all while sustaining one of the strongest economies in the world. And we all know it. California's sustainability policies routinely influence other states, the nation, and the world. So I think that the right way to think about next steps on climate change goes like this: California to Congress to Paris. That description happens, I'm happy to say, to define my travel itinerary for next month as well. I have been invited by Democratic leader Nancy Pelosi to join a congressional delegation to the UN Climate Conference. It's going to be, yeah. I'll see you there, Ken. Yeah. It's going to be a whirlwind. We're going to finish our final votes of the week, get on a plane to Paris, participate in as much of the conference as we can, and then rush back before Congress begins session again the following week. But I really wanted to be part of this delegation for two reasons. First, this is such an important moment, I think, for the climate movement. It really does feel like we're on the cusp of breaking through. And the second reason is, unfortunately, I really need to be there to help provide a counterweight to some of my colleagues who are going to Paris explicitly to disrupt and undermine climate negotiations. Now, some of you may have seen the recent Time magazine poll a couple weeks ago showed that the number of climate deniers in America is at an all-time low. So that's the great news. The bad news is that all the remaining climate deniers are in Congress. There is some competition for the title of biggest climate denier, but I think everybody's short list would include Senator Jim Inhofe of Oklahoma. I won't tell you the usual story of how this last winter he came to the Senate floor with a snowball to prove that global warming isn't happening. I have a new one for you. He has recently announced that he's considering traveling to Paris to actively undermine American negotiators. He boasts about helping derail the 2009 Copenhagen climate talks, and now, to use his own words, he wants to go and, quote, be the bad guy in Paris. So Jim Inhofe's last tango in Paris. And when I heard about that, I couldn't help thinking about the first time I traveled to France over 20 years ago. And I remember I was having dinner in this nice, quaint little restaurant, and there was this group of Americans that was being really loud and unruly. And one of them was especially out of control, had a Texas accent, was complaining about how the waiter couldn't speak English. And I was so embarrassed because I knew everyone in that restaurant was forming judgments about the United States of America based on this one ignorant, arrogant person. And no, this is not a metaphor for the Bush presidency. This really happened. So it seems to me that we can't let something like that be the only impression of America at the Paris climate talks. We have to show the world that Americans, including a lot of their representatives in Congress, actually value science and facts and want to be part of a strong international response to climate change. But nevertheless, it is a serious challenge. Senator Inhofe is not just any senator. He chairs the Senate Environment Committee. Over on the House side, one of his counterparts is a gentleman named Lamar Smith of Texas. He chairs the Science Committee, aggressive climate denier, just as much as Jim Inhofe. Under his leadership, we have to call it the Science Committee. So the leadership of the majority party in Congress right now, I'm sorry to say, has literally put folks like this in charge of key committees in order to shut down any progress on climate change. And that's why when I saw the advertised title for my remarks tonight, Can Congress Put a Price on Carbon?, I realized that we're probably asking the wrong question. Of course, Congress can put a price on carbon, but the leadership of this Congress isn't going to do it. If that's the only question that we ask tonight, the answer is no. My speech is over. We can all get in our Priuses and go home. But I suggest that we ought to be asking two broader questions. The first would be, what can we do within the political constraints as they exist today to continue making progress on climate change? And second, how can we change the political situation so that we can do a lot more, including beginning to put a price on carbon? As we think about those questions, I think it's important to recognize that we have got an awful lot going for us. The debate over global climate change is essentially over. People are convinced we won. Extreme weather events, like the historic drought we've been experiencing in California, are focusing public attention in a very real way on this issue. And the latest polls show that despite billions of dollars that the fossil fuel industry has poured into sowing doubt on this subject, the American people recognize that climate change is happening. Meanwhile, major corporations are signing President Obama's American Business Act on Climate pledge. From Walmart and General Motors to Autodesk here in Marin, to more than 80 other companies, we have commitments from corporate America to support a climate change agreement in Paris. These are household name businesses agreeing with President Obama that we need a low-carbon, sustainable future, and that's a big deal. So is the fundamental shift in power generation that's taking place right before our eyes. You heard a little bit about it from prior speakers, but this trend towards renewables and away from fossil fuels is happening way faster than anyone had projected even just a few years ago. Last year, for the first time, there were more renewables in terms of installed new power generation than fossil, both in the United States and around the globe. Globally, we invested last year $270 billion in renewable energy. Global energy experts project that this trend will only accelerate, with renewables comprising half of total energy, not just new installed capacity, in 15 years. Remember the old line we always heard from those opposed to global climate leadership, that China would never follow our lead? Well, guess what? China is actually leading the way on renewables. They're spending twice as much as the United States and the European Union combined. But that's not to say that the United States is a slouch. We're doing pretty well. Over the first 6 months of this year, solar energy alone made up 40% of all new electric generating capacity in the United States. So there is a sea change underway. And one reason for it is that the cost of renewable energy continues to plummet. This is another trend that is only going to continue. According to a recent study by Lawrence Berkeley National Labs, not exactly a liberal think tank, the average price of utility scale solar in the United States is now 5 cents a kilowatt hour. That's a 70% decline since just 2009. Wind is even cheaper. Utilities around the country are snapping up this affordable, renewable energy because it's the best deal for their ratepayers, and it happens to be good for the planet at the same time. And there's also a major shift going on in the way the international community has approached the conference in Paris next month. And it reflects a very intentional strategy by President Obama, Secretary Kerry, and their team to avoid repeating the mistakes of Kyoto. They understand that it doesn't help us or the planet to have a very ambitious treaty signed in Paris if there isn't real buy-in and a real commitment to action from all the countries, both big and small. And that's why you've seen so much advance work done between the United States and so many other countries, including just 2 weeks ago, when you may have noticed there was a joint presidential statement between the United States and China, under which each country commits to, quote, move ahead decisively to implement domestic climate policies and achieve a global low-carbon transformation during the course of this century. That kind of progress is a big deal when you consider that China's greenhouse gas emissions dwarf our own. Now, in recent months, we've also seen greenhouse gas reduction targets released by a whole host of other countries: India, Brazil, South Korea, Mexico, Indonesia, and the European Union. In fact, according to a recent NRDC analysis, the countries who've already released carbon emission reduction plans as part of the lead-up to the Paris summit account for more than 90% of global carbon emissions. Our American climate envoy, a gentleman named Todd Stern, who's been traveling all over the world to help line up some of these agreements, testified in the Senate last month that these plans represent a momentum-building drumbeat. This momentum is real, and it is a game changer politically and strategically. when China and the European Union and all of these other countries are stepping up with real commitments to reduce greenhouse gases, the favorite old canard of climate deniers, the fact that the United States can't lead because none of the other countries will follow, well, suddenly that just goes up in smoke. And perhaps most encouraging, it's not just commitments from national governments. There's all sorts of subnational climate action too. California, of course, is one of the greatest examples. But even at the local and regional level, our mayors, our water districts, clean energy programs, and sustainable businesses are pushing the envelope. We have so many examples here in my district, the 2nd District of California. But one of the ones that I'll just share with you, I got to celebrate this year. It involves the Sonoma County Water Agency, which is our largest regional water wholesaler and provider. Back in 2006, the Sonoma County Water Agency, realizing it was the largest energy consumer in Sonoma County, set a very audacious goal to run a carbon-free water system by 2015. And earlier this year, I got to be there with them and speak at the celebration. They achieved that goal. And now they're moving on. I could cite so many other exciting, energizing examples right here in my district, but even beyond this great green bubble that I am privileged to represent, we're seeing communities all over the country stepping up to implement their own ambitious climate plans. So the city of Philadelphia, for example, now tracks and reports both municipal and citywide greenhouse gas emissions, and they will release a climate plan this month in anticipation of the Paris conference. In Arizona, where their state legislature is actively urging Congress to reject President Obama's Clean Power Plan, the city of Phoenix has been ratcheting up its own renewable energy portfolio, installing 15 megawatts of solar power for its public works buildings and pursuing a very ambitious tree and shade master plan to cut energy use and reduce the heat island effect in that city. I could give all sorts of examples from almost every part of the country. 20 years ago, after the UN treaty was negotiated in Kyoto, it was attacked here in the United States with the slogan, "It's not global and it won't work." Well, this new climate diplomacy is global, it's also local, and it will work. It's part of a broader good news story on climate change, where we see consensus building and bold leadership breaking out from capitals all over the world, to corporate shareholder meetings and boardrooms, to people-powered movements like 350.org and this forum here tonight. It even includes our secret weapon, the guy that drives around in that fuel-efficient Fiat, Pope Francis, who is galvanizing global support on this issue from a perspective of his faith, and he's making incredible headway. The world really is primed to take action in Paris and beyond. But as I alluded to earlier, I also have some bad news. And frankly, there's no way that I can describe it without sounding pretty partisan, because the reality is the current Republican leadership has made Congress a sanctuary of climate denial and a weapon for politically motivated attacks on climate science. And we could actually use up all of the time we have together tonight just going through all the different examples of this, but I'll just mention one very recent one. The Republican Science Committee Chair, Lamar Smith of Texas, a few weeks ago, launched a scorched earth inquiry to cast doubt on a federal study that thoroughly debunks one of the favorite myths that we hear from climate deniers. That myth being that global warming inexplicably paused in 1998 and has not resumed, and therefore we can't trust any of the climate models, and all of this climate change hysteria is a bunch of bunk. Well, Chairman Smith was upset because a peer-reviewed NOAA study earlier this year reached the same conclusion as just about every other peer-reviewed study, that global warming never paused and that climate deniers are factually wrong. So he responded by using the subpoena power of his committee to go on a fishing expedition in an attempt to discredit the administrator of NOAA. And we see things like that all the time in this Congress. It's really par for the course. The Energy and Commerce Committee has done the same thing by spending a huge amount of time trying to undermine the administration's Clean Power Plan and other carbon pollution policies, instead of looking at any meaningful ways to transition to a cleaner, renewable economy. The Natural Resources Committee, on which I serve, has ignored my repeated request to have real hearings on climate change, what it means for our environment, for our oceans, our infrastructure, our water supplies, our public health, or how we can better manage our public lands to actually sequester carbon and help reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Instead of this, we have hearings that ridicule and seek to embarrass federal officials who try to incorporate climate change into their policies and decisions. The truth is, we are the only major democracy in the world that allows a climate-denying party to hold the majority of the legislature. But our predicament's actually worse than that. Not only do other countries not put climate deniers in charge, no other party in any democratic country actually embraces climate denial. So to my Republican friends, I hate to tell you, the leadership of your party has not only left you, it has left every other conservative party on the planet. Take Canada and Australia. Both have major conservative parties that, like our own, love their domestic fossil fuel industries. Tar sands in Canada, coal in Australia. That's where the similarity ends. The conservative parties in those countries have actually considered the evidence and accepted the proposition that their countries should take action on climate and clean energy. Their positions don't go nearly far enough, but it's a huge difference from what we see here in America. And here in America, it's not just Senator Jim Inhofe and Congressman Smith leading the climate denial charge. It's the whole GOP leadership structure. All of the presidential candidates, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who has actually taken to personally urging states to ignore the Clean Power Plan and violate the Clean Air Act and litigate. He's actually gone international with this, warning other countries against striking climate deals with the United States. So much for partisan politics ending at the water's edge. A recent political science paper that looked at 9 different countries' conservative parties summarized the situation like this. The U.S. Republican Party is an anomaly in denying anthropogenic climate change. So that's the reality, folks. This is a party that is very different, and to my Republican friends, I wish you luck in bringing your party back and regaining some common sense. We need that from the Republican Party. The country needs that. But right now, it's pretty grim. That does not mean that we're going to give up. So the question is, what can we do? Well, I suggest 3 things. And the first is, we have to defend what this administration has already accomplished or set in motion by way of climate leadership. The biggest of those is the Clean Power Plan, which was finalized in August. This plan is the first ever national carbon pollution standard for existing power plants. When it's implemented, it's going to put us on a path to a 32% reduction in carbon pollution by 2030. It is a huge deal. And guess what? It didn't even require an act of Congress. It used existing authority under the Clean Air Act. Now, it is being challenged in court. Again, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell is urging states to challenge it and ignore it. And on almost every must-pass piece of legislation in this Congress, there is a Republican rider that tries to block it or defund it or undermine it in some way. So we're going to have to stay vigilant and continue to defend this important forward progress. The second one is the Keystone decision. Huge, huge decision. We're celebrating it, of course, but don't expect Congress to just sort of give up on this issue and go away. A few months earlier this year, when President Obama wisely vetoed legislation that tried to codify the Keystone Project, the Senate barely failed to override the veto, barely upheld the veto. It was a 4-vote margin. So we're going to need to keep up the pressure on both the Senate and the House to hold our ground on Keystone and make sure that pipeline stays dead. A third example would be fuel economy standards. This is something that the Obama administration doesn't get enough credit for. But back in 2012, aggressive standards were set for cars and light trucks. Some new standards are rolling out from EPA in the months ahead. There's going to be huge carbon reduction from these. They are absolutely driven by California. Ken Alex and his colleagues over the last decade put California on a path to leading the nation through our own clean car rule, something we're allowed to do based on a specific provision in the Clean Air Act. It was litigated and challenged, but it was upheld. And after all that litigation, the Obama administration was basically able to take the California rule and go national with it. We can expect lots of legislative attempts to try to throw a monkey wrench into these fuel economy standards, and we're going to have to defend them. The second thing that we can do is continue to push Congress and work creatively to make incremental progress despite the tough politics that we face. And there's all sorts of ways that I could tell you that I'm trying to do this. I was able to partner with a very unlikely colleague, Tom McClintock, a conservative Republican from inland California, on an amendment to remove this absurd rider in the defense appropriations bill that has required for the last 30 years a certain Air Force base in Germany to buy bituminous coal from a specific facility in Pennsylvania. It's just been on the books forever, and every year the Pentagon says we really don't want that anymore, we'd like to buy cheaper energy, cleaner energy, but this is a relic, a zombie earmark from a prior era. I was able to reach across party lines. Tom McClintock and I partnered. We passed that amendment through the House of Representatives, and yeah. And there's other ways in which I'm constantly working to try to forge unlikely alliances and make a little bit of incremental progress. But as we do that, we also need to keep putting out big ideas, because the politics will change. Political windows will open, and we've got to keep the pressure on. So I'm introducing things like my bill to put a carbon tax on transportation fuels and to replace the current gas tax as part of our transportation infrastructure funding challenge. I'm introducing a bill to require the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, which for every piece of legislation Congress considers gives a fiscal score. It tells you what the effect will be on the deficit. I want them to give the same thing on the effect on greenhouse gases and climate change. So I have a bill to do that, and it should be no surprise that I haven't had a hearing on that bill. I haven't had a vote on that bill, but I'm going to keep pushing, and we've made a little bit of progress, because a few weeks ago you may have noticed there was a Republican bill to lift the 40-year ban on crude oil exports, a really bad idea that I opposed vigorously. But as part of that debate, I proposed an amendment that would at least require the Department of Energy to report on the greenhouse gas emissions caused by increased crude oil exports. I expected that to be opposed and probably defeated, but for some reason, maybe because it was late at night, maybe because people wanted to get on airplanes, the Republican floor manager accepted my amendment, and it became part of this really terrible bill that is going to lift the cap on exports. So we've got to keep trying, and sometimes good things will happen. The last thing I'll mention that we can and ought to do is to play the long game. We've got to change Congress. We've got to create the conditions for the next president and the next Congress to put our good ideas into action. That means winning elections. That means doing the kinds of things that Josh Friday and Next Gen Climate are doing and that he talked about earlier. The fact is, the House of Representatives is only going to vote on stuff that the Speaker allows to come up for a vote. We've seen the last few years what that's probably going to mean. So who has the majority, who gets to become Speaker, really, really matters. When Nancy Pelosi was Speaker, the House of Representatives raised fuel efficiency standards. It strengthened building efficiency laws, expanded renewable energy incentives. She even established a freestanding committee focused on climate change. And of course, the House passed a bill to put a price on carbon, the Waxman-Markey climate bill. Now, it created a cap and trade program, and I realize there's lots of folks here that would prefer a more straightforward approach to carbon pricing, a fee and dividend approach, or a carbon tax. Yeah? Those are great ideas, and we can and should consider them once we can wrest that gavel back into the right hands so that we can actually have hearings and vote on these things. But the point is, under Nancy Pelosi's leadership, it was a whole different agenda, and that's why it really matters which party is in the majority and who holds that gavel in each house. We have to win some elections. The stakes are just as high in the presidential race. I don't have to tell you the difference between someone like Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders, who are going to build on the leadership President Obama has shown, and almost any of the Republican candidates. The Clean Power Plan, if any of them are elected, gone. Fuel efficiency standards, absolutely gone. And they're going to appoint a whole bunch of new federal judges, and they'll be the ones deciding the litigation that challenges the Clean Power Plan and probably challenges any agreement that comes out of Paris. So the stakes are very high. elections matter, and we have to include that as part of our response. I want to close on a more hopeful note that perhaps offers some mitigation for my harsh words about the American Republican Party a little bit earlier. You know about the Freedom Caucus. This is the band of about 40 House Republicans who ousted John Boehner as Speaker and who have led us into one fiscal crisis after another. What you may not know about is a smaller but much smarter caucus within the Republican conference. It's led by Chris Gibson of New York. And he has brought about a dozen other Republicans onto a resolution recognizing climate change and calling for action. Let that sink in for a second. To have Republicans who are sitting members of Congress recognize climate change and acknowledge that something needs to be done about it, that is a huge deal. Now, the fact that that's a big deal is itself kind of a problem. But it's a sign that things might be changing. And one of these intrepid Republicans, Carlos Curbelo of Miami, just wrote an op-ed in the Miami Herald saying that lawmakers need to do a better job of investing in clean energy and combating climate change. He represents some of the most vulnerable landscape in the country, the South Florida coast, including the Keys and the Everglades. So this is very real for him. I am working with these intrepid Republicans. But we're being very careful to let this be a Republican-led effort. That's important for it to have any chance of success. So Representative Gibson is keeping in touch with me and updating me on his progress. And we've agreed that when he gets as many Republican colleagues as he can on the resolution, he's going to have me go out and get an equal number of Democrats so that there is some parity, and we will introduce this resolution as a bipartisan measure and see what happens. I wanted to share that with you. I wanted to share that because no matter what you see on C-SPAN a lot of the time, despite some of the horror stories that I've told you about Congress, there really is a huge amount of momentum in our favor. We definitely are on the right side of history, and I believe we're on the cusp of major breakthroughs in addressing climate change, and that forward momentum is even beginning to be reflected in that last bastion of climate denial, the current Republican Congress. Thank you.
Since we're getting ready for the holidays, I'm reminded that we always think about Thanksgiving and other upcoming holidays and family gatherings, and everybody always talks about that crazy uncle that you have in the corner. We have James Inhofe instead as a nation. But fortunately, we have people like Jared Huffman that we know are going to be in Paris counterbalancing that. So thank you for your leadership, Congressman. We have one more speaker, and then we're going to have a chance to have a panel and get to your questions. Susan Stevenson is the Executive Director of Interfaith Power and Light. Susan.
Hello. Thank you, President Marcy and Dominican University, and all of you for being here tonight to hear about leadership on climate. All of you, and Marin County has been a great leader already, so thank you for not just sitting back on your climate laurels, but coming out to hear about how to do more. So the organizers of this event asked me to talk about this question, can moral passion lead to climate action? My answer is an emphatic yes. In fact, I think it's essential if we're going to have lasting, meaningful change, which entails creating a whole new relationship with the earth and how we live on it. I also base that answer on history. In the United States, successful social change has almost always needed religious leaders and faith communities. From the abolition of slavery to civil rights, when people begin to hear about issues in the context of values and from a trusted faith leader, it can change their perspective. Faith communities also reinforce and strengthen our shared values and each other's commitment, which is important since some of these struggles can last decades or more. Not only was the Reverend Martin Luther King inseparable from the civil rights movement, but many other religious leaders, like sisters, rabbis, and ministers, marching here, and the infrastructure of churches was essential to its success. Clergy demonstrated in front of Woolworths with signs saying segregation is morally wrong. Clergy led the Selma March of 1965. Religious communities also helped to bring about the abolition of slavery and women's right to vote. Lucretia Mott was a Quaker minister and a force for both abolition and later women's suffrage. The picture on the right here is women in 1917 marching down Fifth Avenue in New York. The placards they were carrying displayed the signatures of 1 million American women who wanted the vote. The importance of the involvement of clergy and faith leaders in these causes really can't be understated. They gave moral authority and mainstream credibility to movements that had been marginalized. It was harder to jail or dismiss priests and sisters than notorious agitators like Susan B. Anthony. They helped people relate to the issue with values and human dignity and justice. So for all these reasons, Interfaith Power and Light works with congregations as our key organizing unit. Currently, we have about 18,000 in our network, which sounds like a lot until you think about how many faith communities there are in the United States. We're actually an extremely religious country. Does anyone care to guess how many houses of worship in the United States? Wild guess? Not a million, about over 300,000 though. And that represents about 60% of all Americans who are part of a religious community. The first thing we do when we work with congregations is we help them to take action to model clean energy solutions in their facilities and energy efficiency. And our congregations love solar. We get calls every day from congregations all over the country wanting to know how they can get solar on their rooftop. They become very passionate about it. And as you can tell, it takes a lot of energy and passion to get a bishop in full vestments up to bless these solar panels in Massachusetts. And this is called a community power plant because Massachusetts has something really cool called community solar, which we theoretically have in California, but we need to work on a little more at the PUC. And with this installment, this church is actually creating about 4 times the solar that they need. So they're able to provide solar, sell the solar through the grid to other churches in the area. Nationwide, hundreds of our congregations have gone solar, and about 4,000 have done green building projects. Right here locally, St. Stephen's in Belvedere has solar on the rooftop. What you may not know, unless you've flown over, is that it's in the shape of a cross. And right here at Dominican, Meadowlands Hall, I believe, is LEED certified. Over across the bay in Oakland, we have Temple Sinai as an active member congregation, and many Jewish congregations all over the country are part of IPL. The Jewish concept of tikkun olam, which means repairing the world, is an important tenet and motivator for environmental actions. This temple is LEED Silver certified. We also recognize congregations for all of their actions, especially those that are less visible than solar on the rooftop. We want to make sure their congregation, their community knows what they're doing. So we provide these plaques for certified cool congregations. And internationally, in the developing world, faith communities are at the forefront. These Buddhist monks in Cambodia are protecting forests by patrolling them to stop poaching and illegal logging. Here they're actually ordaining a tree as a monk. Not only does that send a message to the would-be logger that there are grave karmic consequences to cutting that tree down, tantamount to killing a monk, but it also sends a message that I think a lot of us share, a feeling that a lot of us share whether we're Buddhist or not, that there is a sacredness in nature. There's a sense of divinity, even in a tree. Even a tree can be a monk. We know that climate change is hurting poor people in vulnerable places most of all. That's why it's such a moral imperative that we act. This Mexican family was in the path of Hurricane Patricia, which hit mostly rural areas. And it's not only the impacts of climate change that's an inequitable killer. Fossil fuel pollution wreaks more havoc in poor communities, among the elderly, children, people with respiratory problems. Chinese air pollution levels are famously bad. They're also demonstrably shortening lifespans. Over 7 million people a year globally die from air pollution. So how do we involve the poor, who are most impacted, but did the least to cause this crisis? That's a good question, and one that I'm glad our organizers here are asking of us. We have an opportunity to do that through our congregations. We have multiple income levels of people attending congregations, working together. And I think most of us want to be creating a movement that's not just for the poor and vulnerable who are most harmed by climate change, but of them too. And part of how we do that, I think, is making clean energy solutions and benefits available widely, and most especially to those communities that have been hardest hit by fossil fuel pollution. California is already setting the standard in this with SB 535, as we heard about. We also work with partners like Grid Alternatives to provide free to very low-cost solar to low-income households. We can also be more active in impacted communities. Right here in the Bay Area, places like West Oakland suffer from very high rates of asthma and heart disease due to the fossil fuel pollution. Let's look at past movements that have been successful. Civil rights leader Reverend Gerald Durley, who's on our board of directors, tells us that they may not have won civil rights if they had waited for a majority. What they needed, he said, was a critical mass of passionate people ready to take action. We know we already have a large majority of Americans who believe that climate change is a problem and have concerns about it. Why hasn't that translated to political change? Maybe what we're lacking is moral passion. The good news is we do have a very excellent new clergy spokesperson. He's already been going around the world talking about climate change, and you might have heard of him already. Pope Francis, yay. So could Pope Francis be a game changer? Could he be our Martin Luther King for climate? He has global credibility and is probably one of the most popular and beloved people in the world right now. He also doesn't shirk from speaking truth to power and calling for radical change. Right now, he's using his platform to lay out a passionate and savvy case for climate action, clearly aiming to influence the UN climate talks. A new report pulls from 8 years of survey data tracing the relationship between religious affiliation and belief in global warming, and found acceptance of the facts of global warming are up for Americans of all religious beliefs. Pope Francis has influenced this change demonstrably, with 15% now saying they are more convinced that global warming is happening and that they should act due to the papal encyclical. That's a pretty big chunk of people. Not only that, but the hardest to reach religious constituency, the evangelicals, support for action on global warming is up 16% from spring to fall to 65%. This is a breakthrough. Here in the US, people of all faiths are inspired by Francis' championing of the issue. Interfaith Power and Light affiliates around the country organize vigils, marches, and rallies in 30 cities on the eve of the Pope's speech to Congress. This is a march in Indianapolis. And at our Delaware vigil, Senator Coons himself stopped by apparently really enjoyed talking about the need for moral action on climate change. Now we have a quiz. Does anybody know who said this? We have a moral obligation to leave our children a planet that's not polluted or damaged. Sound familiar? No? Yes, Barack Obama, our president. Over the past several years, President Obama has really embraced the moral message in his speeches. And I think that's because the moral message is a powerful political message. That's why we bring clergy and lay leaders to Sacramento and Washington lobby days, and we don't only have the pleasure of meeting with Jared Huffman. We have an Oklahoma affiliate. We meet with Senator Inhofe. We have a Kentucky affiliate. We meet with Mitch McConnell. And we go to Sacramento. This is our Los Angeles delegation, and here are our Alaska folks in front of the Hart Senate building. And I couldn't finish without showing this one, a great example of grassroots organizing success. Analysts also credited the grassroots movement with changing the president's thinking on this issue. This has been a very long struggle, but it's worth remembering at the outset that many people thought Keystone was a lost cause. That's why this win is particularly sweet. So now you're all wondering, how can I be part of this moral movement for climate action? If you're a part of a religious congregation, good news, please sign up with California Interfaith Power and Light. If you are already a member, get involved with our newly forming Marin Working Group. Take our Paris Pledge to send a message to Paris that your faith community and your household is prepared to cut emissions in half by 2030 and be carbon neutral by 2050. This is what we want our delegates and our representatives, our global representatives in Paris to commit to, so we're leading by doing it ourselves. I also want to invite all of you to a very inspiring event tomorrow evening in Oakland. It's called the Cool Climate Awards, and we'll be honoring 6 outstanding congregations for their exemplary efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and educate their communities about the moral urgency of climate change. You're all invited. Please come, 6 o'clock, Cathedral of Christ the Light, Lake Merritt tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you to Susan, and we'll now shift to the Q&A section of the evening and have a chance to answer some of your questions. I've already got quite a few questions, but if you have others, please send them to the ushers and they'll bring them up, and we'll spend 20 minutes or so talking about the questions that are at the top of your minds.
Here, do you want mine? You're taller than I am. That's okay.
All right. So I have a few questions that are for specific panelists, and so I'll start with those, and then we'll open it up a bit more broadly. The first for Ken Alex. Will California continue the tax rebate for electric vehicles, or better yet, increase it?
Yeah, very timely question. So the tax rebate for electric vehicles will continue. There is about to be a cost or income cap. There has been a lot of criticism for $100,000 Teslas getting a rebate. And so there's going to be some change to that, but the rebate itself is continuing.
Great. And Congressman Huffman, some conversation about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and specifically, how does that partnership and other trade deals, how do they have the potential to impact our domestic and international climate action?
Well, the Trans-Pacific Partnership is not going to help any of the things we're talking about on climate change. This agreement is actually completely silent on climate change. It's been purged of any provision that might have been able to use trade commitments as a way to enforce climate agreements, which is very unfortunate. That happened at the request of Republicans in Congress. There's a sort of a related piece of legislation pending in Congress, the Customs Bill, that includes an even worse provision. It would, if passed, prevent any future trade deal from having anything at all on climate, and obviously we're going to have a big old fight about that as it goes forward. The last thing about the TPP is it could be worse than just neutral. It could be affirmatively bad on climate in at least this respect. It probably has the effect of requiring the United States to start exporting liquefied natural gas, which of course will create even more demand for fracking and fossil fuel production here in the United States. It will also, because of a unique investor-state dispute resolution provision, allow multinational corporations to challenge not only national but state and local laws and ordinances that they believe impair their expected profits. And so I think you can expect Ken, Alex, and others in Sacramento to be on the defensive with respect to all sorts of clean air and public health and climate leadership that we've shown here in California. All of that at some point will probably be challenged in front of not a court where you have some expectation of due process and rights to appeal and things like that, but a panel of corporate attorneys that basically are accountable to no one with no appeal rights. So several reasons to oppose the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Those are just a few of the greatest hits in my view.
So question that's not directed specifically to panelists. I'm wondering, Josh, you talked quite a bit about alternative energy, so maybe we'll start with you, but let others chime in. The question is whether increased nuclear energy should be or is on the table as a way to reduce carbon emissions, and what your thinking is about that.
So we, is this working? Is this on? Yeah. Thank you. It's an interesting question for me personally. I was stationed in Japan with my family when I was a lieutenant in the United States Navy when the earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear disaster happened. And within hours of the first nuke blowing, my wife, who was 3 months pregnant at the time, was evacuated, and I was sent out to the ship with the admiral to oversee the entire humanitarian aid and disaster relief effort at a time when we thought we were hours away from evacuating all of Tokyo, which only has about 20 million people. So this is obviously something, an issue that is hard and affects humans in a very real way, and I've seen that. Our organization and Tom Steyer's has been very clear that any path forward for trying to hit the goals that we should have for clean energy and renewable energy in this country should not include new nuclear. And I'm sure there's others on the panel who would love to take this question.
I agree.
Okay, the next question, Ken, is for you again. It's about California and fracking. It says, how can California claim to be a global climate leader while it continues to allow fracking?
So we could spend quite a lot of time on this, but I'll try to be brief. First, New York has gotten a lot of good press for having a ban on fracking. California does not use the form of fracking that New York banned. That's number one. Number two, the latest estimate of frackable oil in California is minuscule. So at least the new form of fracking, there's historic fracking that's somewhat different. So those are 2 points. The third is Californians drive 332 billion miles a year, and that actually requires some oil. So there is some need, until we phase it out, to have oil. If fracking cannot be done in an environmentally appropriate manner, then it should be regulated to the point that it can, and if it still can't, then it should not occur. And that's the approach that California is taking without an outright ban.
So you mentioned how much time we spend in our cars. So one of the next questions is about public transport. And the question is, public transport seems essential to reduce CO2 from cars, yet it's still woefully underfunded. What can be done to significantly increase public transport? So, Congressman, you want to start with that one?
Well, sure. I mean, it is going to take both federal, state, and local contributions, I think, to get public transit to where it needs to be. Federal transportation funding is a significant part of it. In California, our transportation funding relies about 40% on federal funding through the Highway Trust Fund, which is funded entirely by a gas tax that hasn't been increased since 1993. And you know, we could have lots of conversations about the right funding engine for that federal contribution. It does support transit to a degree. A lot of the transit funding, though, comes at the state level or through local tax contributions. But right now, probably our best hope is some kind of an increase in the gas tax to increase the amount of funding from the federal side. We have not been able to put that into the latest transportation bill, but the good news is we did pass a 6-year transportation authorization out of the House last week. I'm on the Transportation Committee, and I can tell you that in this Congress, for what you might expect, it's not a bad bill. It's not a bad bill. It just doesn't have quite enough funding. And yet we were able to do something very important. We put a provision in there that says that any new revenue that materializes in the years ahead will automatically go out to the transportation programs. It won't have to wait for Congress to appropriate it. That means that when the political window does open for us to do the right thing on transportation infrastructure and transit, whether it's an increase in the gas tax or a carbon fee or any number of other things, that money's going to go right out, and transit will get at least its fair share. We'll work on doing even more than that in the years ahead, I hope.
I'll add something on that. Please. I would just also add that transit is one of those technologies that we actually have now and we can use. It doesn't require a breakthrough. It requires more funding. A number of our congregations and folks have gotten involved in the East Bay to protect the youth bus pass, which was on the cutting board. I would encourage you all to get involved with transit issues locally. We can have a big impact there, and transit also is something that tends to be used much more by low-income people, by the elderly, by students, by people who really need it and have no other way to get around. So let's prioritize this as part of our advocacy.
So I agree with all that. There is a pretty big shift being undertaken in California, and as usual, California is leading the way in a lot of this. There's a law called SB 375 that requires regional plans, and these regional plans must reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and the regional plans are the transit and transportation plan for the particular region. In addition, there's a technical change that is hard to explain but actually pretty dramatic, moving from evaluation of what is called level of service, which is basically traffic delay, to a measure called vehicle miles traveled, which radically alters the relationship of dollars to transport as opposed to dollars for freeways. And you're starting to see that in the Bay Area, and even more so in Los Angeles. I grew up in Los Angeles, and you couldn't get anywhere without a car. And in 10 years, you will be able to get anywhere in Los Angeles pretty much by public transit. It's kind of amazing.
So I think this is our last question for this evening, and I want to, I think somebody's channeling Bill McKibben a little bit here. So the question is, what is the role of divestment from fossil fuel companies in the overall effort to fight climate change? So, Congressman, you want to start us off?
Well, I have a couple thoughts about that. I think divestment is very important. We've seen it work, obviously, with apartheid and other examples. But I think something just as important is taking those companies that have begun to show climate leadership. I mentioned that over 80 of them have signed the President's action document heading into Paris. That's a great thing. But there's still a disconnect between what they say in these commitments, certainly the public messaging they do about their resolve in being part of a climate solution, and their politics. Almost across the board, even leading edge corporate citizens on climate change are still supporting folks in Congress that are the worst climate deniers. And I could give you a million examples, but one that is really kind of shocking is the ski industry. You would think climate change would be kind of an existential issue for these guys, right? They give, now they have supported me a little bit, so thank you, ski industry. But they give almost entirely to Republicans. So that's interesting. The wind industry, the American wind industry, kind of climate change would seem, good climate policy would seem to be very, very good for business in the wind industry. They contribute almost entirely to Republicans on the Ways and Means Committee so that they can focus on getting their tax credit extensions, and the folks that they support turn around and are the worst climate deniers in the world. So to the extent that you're a shareholder or have access to corporate boardrooms or these industry associations that are beginning to do the right thing on climate change, I suggest, not just the divestment approach, but really encouraging them to think about their political engagement and try to reconcile that with the good progress we're starting to make on climate.
Susan, is this something that you're looking at in terms of citizen action in your congregations?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's very important to, as part of sending that moral message, that we don't want our dollars to be invested in industries that are ruining the planet, and a chance for life, a good life on Earth by our children and grandchildren. And faith communities are taking action here. The United Church of Christ has been a leader. Just recently, the Episcopal Diocese of California voted to divest. And we also have an ongoing campaign with 350.org to divest the Vatican. So watch for that.
Okay. Go ahead.
So I'm a two-time Berkeley Cal grad, so of course I'm for divestment, and think it's made a big difference. And Tom, the founder of Next Gen Climate, is also on the board of Stanford, which is taking leadership on this issue. And I think one of the things that, in terms of citizen action, that we've been so encouraged by with this issue, and I think everything that Congressman Huffman said is true in terms of how we move forward. But what's been so exciting is how young people, how millennials and people on campus across the country have been activated by this issue on their campuses and have really felt empowered to push this issue and to push it in their schools and in their universities and with their parents. And we want to continue to support that and ensure that that sort of activism and excitement continues throughout the country.
Well, I think we have just a couple of things left to do this evening. One is that we want to recognize the folks who helped make this possible. So before closing, I'd like to invite the 12 partner representatives to join us on stage. So we said this evening was not only about getting informed, but taking action. So along with the action in your programs, we invite you to come up on stage. They're going to stay around for another 30 minutes to show you how you can get involved. You can link to groups online at leadonclimate.org. You can come up and talk to our speakers right now on stage. And finally, I believe that we're going to raise the curtain to Lead on Climate in Marin. So feel free to come up on stage. That was